Hello, in this video we are going to be looking at the problem of evil. We're going to be looking at it as an example against the existence of the Christian God and also some of the responses that have been offered to defend the idea of the Christian God. So we'll look at the logical and evidential problems of evil, the difference between moral and natural evil, the free will defense, and then later on Alvin Plantinga's version of the free will defense, the Theodicies of Bishop Irenaeus and John Hick, and finally, this is not on the spec, but it's something that could be quite useful in an essay, Stephen Law's Evil God Challenge to Atheism. So let's first of all begin by looking at God's attributes. Well, God is supposedly all-powerful in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we've got two biblical quotes here to support that idea. Lord God, behold, thou hast made the heaven and the earth by thy great power, and there is nothing too hard for thee. And in Matthew 19:26, with God all things are possible. And in John, God's all-knowing nature is supposedly supported. God is greater than our heart and he knows everything. And God's omnibenevolence is exemplified in Psalm 145, verse 17. The Lord is just in all his ways and kind in all his doings. Okay, so this is the conception of God in relation to which the problem of evil is a problem. So the problem of evil is best thought about in terms of the logical problem, but there is also the evidential problem of evil that I'll come to in a moment. So the logical problem of evil is a simple one. All right? If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, then how come there is evil in the world? Surely he would not allow evil to happen. If he was all-powerful, he'd be able to stop it. If he was all-knowing, he'd know about it. And obviously, if he's all-loving, he will have the motive to stop suffering. Okay? So an all-good God would not want evil. An all-powerful God would be able to prevent it. And an all-knowing God would know when it was about to happen. Now, this logical problem of evil was in fact first formulated by the Greek philosopher Epicurus. But this version has been made much more famous by John Mackey and his inconsistent triad. So that's the logical problem of evil. And in relation to this logical problem, we then have two forms of evil that you need to be able to distinguish. The first is moral evil, and this is the result of morally wrong human actions. Right? Either we do evil to each other or we cause something evil to happen, and then that causes suffering. All right. Such evil goes against God's wishes. So we can think about what it says in the Ten Commandments, for example, or Jesus' love thy neighbor or treat others as you would wish to be treated. Natural evil, on the other hand, is suffering caused by the natural world. So, for example, the Japanese tsunami of 2006, earthquakes, hurricanes, all of those kinds of things that inflict suffering. They're considered natural evil for that reason. All right, and this distinction is important between moral and natural evil. It's an important distinction when we come to examine the differences between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil, and indeed various responses to them. So there's an initial free will response that you can make to the logical problem of evil. Right? And it runs more or less like this. God gave human beings free will in order that we can properly understand good and evil. Right? If we didn't have free will, and if we were just made to do good acts, then we would essentially be automatons incapable of truly understanding goodness. Right? Because we'd have nothing to contrast it with. Everything would be good. It's rather like if every day was sunny and there was never any bad weather, we wouldn't appreciate it. It would just be a sunny day. The reason that we like sunny days is because we have had experience of the opposite, of really bad rainy days, terrible weather, when you can't get outside, that sort of thing. Okay, so according to this initial response, it is required that God gives us the choice to choose between good and evil. All right, and the price that God pays is that some of us choose to do evil. However, as you can see, it does not address the issue of natural evil. Secondly, if God is all-knowing, he would realise that by giving human beings free will, some of us would go on to commit acts of evil. So surely this amounts to knowingly creating suffering from nothing. Okay? Why would God create beings in the first place to which he would give free will, knowing full well that by doing that he would cause suffering where before that there hadn't been any? And this seems to be an argument against the idea of an omnibenevolent God. Right? Why would such a God do this? Why create suffering where there wasn't any in the first place? But even if we accept that there needs to be free will in order to understand the difference between good and evil, the sheer scale of the evil seems to be a problem. All right? So one can accept some evil, but so much of it is apparently gratuitous, and that seems to point at best to a deity that does not care. And many atheists believe, it just shows that there isn't one at all. Right? So if we think about the scale of the evil in the world, we think about the hundreds of thousands of lives that are taken with apparently no goodness coming out of it by natural evil, so Japanese tsunamis, the earthquake and hurricanes in Haiti and the Caribbean, all of those lives that are taken, innocent lives with no apparent good coming out of it. This seems to be a problem because if there is a God, on the assumption that there is a God, it shows them to be a monster, and the alternative just seems to be that there is no God. So a lot of atheists appeal to the evidential problem of evil in order to support their claim that there is no God. However, there are some initial replies to the evidential problem of evil in much the same way that there are some initial replies to the logical problem of evil. Okay, so one of these is that profound suffering leads to acts of goodness that would otherwise not be possible. For example, and you can see in the picture here, the aeroplane that was brought down by passengers all caught up in the 9/11 atrocity in order to stop it ploughing into the White House. So they had heard on their mobile phones that these attacks were taking place elsewhere. When their plane got hijacked, they knew what was going on. They realised they were going to die, and so they were faced with the choice: either let the plane carry on to its target, which was believed to be the White House, or fight back and bring it down somewhere where it would cause no loss of life beyond those people who were actually on board the aeroplane. Okay, so this was a profound piece of moral evil, all right, that then allowed the kind of heroism that we saw emerge from it. All right, so if you didn't have the real catastrophic and apparently gratuitous evil, you wouldn't then have the situation or the context in which profound acts of goodness could emerge. So that's one response to the evidential problem of evil. And if you pause the video for a minute, just see if you can think of any other examples where amazing acts of goodness have resulted from catastrophic evil. Similarly, the evidential problem of evil does allow for one to address aspects of natural evil. So, for example, natural evil that apparently causes a great deal of suffering. Within that, you get amazing acts of charity, people being heroic against the weather conditions, and so on and so forth. So again, in spite of the fact that this evil might look gratuitous, the argument goes that it shows how profoundly good some human beings are. Now let's have a look in more detail at some responses to the problem of evil that have been advanced. In particular, those by Bishop Irenaeus, who was a 2nd century bishop, and much more recently, John Hick's Soul-Making Theodicy. Right? Now, a theodicy is any argument that attempts to defend the existence and idea of the Christian God. In other words, a God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. And as I say, Bishop Irenaeus and John Hick are going to be the focus of this video. Now, Irenaeus maintains that the presence of evil in the created order was a necessary and deliberate action of an all-loving God. All right, and the reason for this is that human beings are allowed through that evil to develop their potential and grow from the image possessing the potential qualities of spiritual perfection to realizing those qualities through trials and suffering that they face and the decisions that they make in response. And if you wanted a biblical story to go with that, you could look no further. You need look no further than the book of Job and the story of Job. So where a good choice is freely made, the individual develops more fully towards spiritual maturity and therefore becomes closer to God. So without evil of either kind, so without either natural evil or moral evil, this kind of realization of goodness and realization of spiritual maturity would not be possible. Virtues such as courage and patience and perseverance could never be developed if there were not challenges that tested such virtues. And of course, such challenges often require a certain degree of suffering. So, for example, a courageous act generally requires that the circumstances surrounding it were causing suffering. Perseverance, again, is something that can be expressed in relation to suffering, perhaps caused by a different kind of thing, but nevertheless, a certain degree of suffering is necessary if you need to persevere with something. So suffering not only enables human beings to become stronger, according to Irenaeus, it also allows them to appreciate goodness more than they otherwise would. So freely choosing to do good is necessary in achieving God's purpose of moulding human beings into perfection. We become, as it were, a perfectly crafted item. Okay, so Irenaeus, from that position, then says that those who resist God's will, right, will be punished in the next life. Okay, and as I said just now, he makes this use of an analogy of God as a craftsman working with human beings as his material. Humans can eventually reach spiritual perfection. If we actively refuse the development of our spiritual perfection, then we will be punished in the next life. So, for example, you might argue that by the deliberate killing of 6 million Jews, Adolf Hitler actually refused the idea of achieving spiritual perfection. And if you look at Irenaeus' Theodicy, you might then argue that God will punish Hitler in the next life. Now, John Hick actually is making a similar point to Irenaeus, but he does develop it. All right. So Hick describes the Irenaean theodicy as a soul-making theodicy, and this is, just by the by, a reference to John Keats' idea that the world is a proving ground for human beings who earn their salvation by working through the stresses and challenges of everyday existence. And Hick also makes the point that in order to be properly free, to be truly free, human beings must be created at what he calls an epistemic distance from God. All right? In other words, they need to be placed in a situation where the existence or non-existence of God is equally likely. All right? So God does not reveal himself sufficiently well to persuade people that he definitely exists. All right? So we have the freedom to choose to believe that God does not exist. All right? So this is true human freedom. All right? In terms of allowing human beings to respond to God or not. Now, we can perhaps put a bit more of a sort of modern spin on this. Right? God creates human beings as free and provides us with the choice of believing in him or not. Had he not done that, had God just made his existence obvious so that we could be sure of it, then what we choose to do would doubtless be influenced by that, okay? Because you would know that God was watching you, so you wouldn't actually be free to choose to do wrong. You would feel compelled to do right. It's rather like, if you're driving and you're being followed by a police car, right? You know that you'll probably get pulled over for for doing over 30 miles an hour in a 30 limit. But you're free. So although you still have the freedom to break the speed limit, you're far less likely to do so because you know that you are being watched. All right. So God deliberately does not make his existence obvious, so that we genuinely do have the ability to choose between right and wrong. And similarly, it will be like then not having a police car following you in a 30 limit. You are then much freer to choose whether to stick to the speed limit or whether to break it. So in that sense, God could not create human beings that were spiritually perfect and who are immediately aware of his existence, because goodness developed through ultimate freedom of choice is much more valuable than goodness that's kind of ready-made, all right, or the goodness that occurs as a result of you knowing that you're being watched and therefore you better do the right thing. So that kind of leads us to the end of Hick, but there is one other view that I want us to look at, and that is Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. Okay, and we've kind of seen the basics of this already at the start of the video. So Plantinga's main aim is to try to show that the inconsistent triad can be consistent. In other words, that the logical problem of evil is not actually a problem at all. An omnipotent God cannot be expected to do literally anything. God, for example, cannot make square circles, right? Because there is no such thing as a square circle. Neither can God create beings with free will that never choose evil. And as we've seen with Hick's theodicy, the moral value of genuine free will is obvious, right? It allows us to genuinely choose and then from that understand much more deeply what the distinction between good and evil actually is. There is still one more challenge to those who might be trying to defend God's existence here, and it comes in the form of Stephen Law's evil God challenge. Now, Law himself treats this as an argument to atheism, but you need not do that, and that should become clear at the end of the explanation. So, Stephen Law is particularly interested in the free will defense and in Plantinga's version of it. Okay, and he says, hang on a minute, God could be all evil, because the free will defense can also be used to justify the existence of an all-evil God. Evil God must give human beings free will in order for us to understand just how awful human life can actually be. In the same way that an all-good, all-loving God has to give human beings free will so that we can understand what true goodness is, having experienced evil. Okay? So just as the price good God pays is that some people choose to do evil, so the price that evil God pays is that some people choose to do good. And on the basis of the evidence, you might say, well, look, given the amount of evil in the world, it seems more likely that God is all evil. Right? Now, Law says that if you actually go around asking people, very few people are going to say that it's reasonable to believe in an all-evil God. But given the symmetry of the argument, right, he then says, well, why is it any more reasonable to believe in an all-good God? So from there, he says, well, perhaps it's just not reasonable to believe in a God of any kind whatsoever. So that's the end of this video.